Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My name is Arya Maulana Satrio, and I'm going to talk about language, cognition, and culture. So, our contents in this material is first we are going to talk about language and perception, and then we are going to talk about subject hypothesis, then language determinism, language categories and culture, discourse pattern and culture, language, social class, and cognition. So first things first, we are going to talk about language and perception. So by this means that the way a person talks usually signifies at least some kind of social knowledge about their background, such as what type of social group or class they belong to. Linguistic characteristics of a person's speech are often used to determine their race, age, and gender. When debating gender, it became apparent that the relationship between social influences and language can be perceived as even more complex than it is generally thought. Racial constructionists, sociolinguists, contend that vocabulary not only represents and communicates our social category membership, but also contributes to the construction of our social identities. Okay. Um, still, still in language and perception, we are going to talk about verbal hygiene. So, verbal hygiene was first uh, introduced by Deborah Cameron. So, Deborah Cameron is a British linguist that invented the word verbal hygiene in her edition, in her first edition of her book, published in 1995. According to Cameron, verbal hygiene is a mixed bag of discourses and activities in which people strive to clean up language and make its structure or usage adhere more closely to their values of elegance, honesty, performance, rationality, correctness, and civility. So, to sum it up, verbal hygiene is a way for people to speak about something without sounding um, ignorant or not civilized. So, for example, here we are going with the word mentally unstable. So the word mentally unstable will sound more pleasant and more civilized than the word retarded or idiot, which are highly offensive for some people. So next we are going to talk about Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. And so Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, the idea is the idea that the nature of a language influences a native speaker's comprehension and categorization of experience. And this was proposed by Edward Sapir in 1929 and later developed by Benjamin Whorf. The most well-known example is that they found that the vocabulary used to identify or mark objects had a major effect on people's attitudes and actions. People would smoke or even throw stubs around fuel drums branded as empty, ignoring the fact that they were full of potentially explosive vapor. Why is this? That so from the word empty, people would um, assume that uh, the drums are empty and not having and ignoring the fact that they have potentially explosive vapor. So they feel safe smoking beside it. So next is grammar and cognition. So in the diverse countries, grammatical categories, along with tense, aspect, and gender, encode different aspects of reality. Following Wolff's examination of the Hopi verb system, he concluded that the Hopi understanding of time differs very radically from what Western cultures understand. So time is often, for example, time is often conceived as a path by speakers of European language, for example, with the future ahead and the past behind them. So, okay, we are going to talk about language determinism. Linguistic determinism is the concept used to characterize the strong version of the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. The idea is that because of the variation in their language, people with different cultures think differently. One of the examples is a native speaker of Hopi from North Arizona perceives reality different from a native speaker of English because she uses a different language. We can see this in we can see this because in different language, grammatical categories such as tense, aspect, and gender encode different facets of reality. So, we are going to talk about linguistic categories and culture here. So, Native American and Australian Aboriginal languages are often quoted as examples of primitive language that debunk common misconceptions. For example, arguments that simple cultures cannot have complicated grammars are incorrect. For example, in Kwaikutl, I don't know if I pronounced that right. In Kwaikutl, a Native American language, nouns are grammatically categorized according to whether they are noticeable or not. While any noun in French must be assigned to one of two genders, the Herbal and Australian Aboriginal language has even four gender groups. Using Western standards, the traditional nomadic lifestyle of Australia's Aboriginal people tends to be very easy. Their history, on the other hand, is a thousand of years old, and their language is one of the most fascinating and grammatically complicated the researchers ever studied. And so the cost of language loss. So people's characteristic sociocultural identity is put at risk as they lose their language because, as we all know, culture and language are closely connected. Researchers will be unable to learn and understand the linguistic complexities of a language and the loss of insights of human perception. People who have had their language drowned by another often lose faith in their skills and experience of esteem. While several other causes are also important, language loss is at the least a leading factor in educational and socioeconomic underachievement in this situation. Next is discourse patterns and culture. So when we look at data on interaction styles, we will see how vocabulary, history, and cognition are all interconnected. As Diane Eads study comparing Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal Australians shows cultural variation in discourse practices between the dominant and minority cultures can have significant implications. And where all parties appear to be speaking the same language, culturally different patterns of interaction may lead to misunderstanding. Regardless of the language used, indirectness is highly valued in Aboriginal culture in Australia. It is crucial to prevent becoming invasive. This essentially provides interactional protection to others, which is a critical process in a culture where physical privacy is also scarce. This sociocultural practice is expressed in a variety of forms in debate. It's important to obey the dialogue guidelines if you want facts from an Aboriginal citizen. In Aboriginal English, accurate details about place and time, well as how people are connected to one another, is usually elicited by a statement of rising intonation. Lastly, we're going to talk about language social class and cognition. So the assumptions made by Wolf about the relationship between language, perception, and culture are well supported. One of the advantages was more thorough examination of vernacular varieties, as well as a better understanding that dialect distinctions were only trivial aspects of language with little effect on individual ways of thinking. Whether you use a simple or complex negative construction or mark directly or not, as well as the pronoun you use for the expression for both you and I or me, are not languages and are not language difference that can be used to support a suggestion of cognitive impairment. There, there are also a few cases of language variation that haven't had any significant cognitive consequences. So that's all. Thank you for your attention. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.